Many thanks to the Data Diva Talks Privacy podcast privacy champion, Mine OS, for sponsoring this episode and for supporting our podcast. Data governance has become an even more difficult challenge with constantly evolving regulatory frameworks and AI systems set to introduce monumental complications. That's why I think organizations need MineOS. This platform helps organizations control and manage their enterprise data by providing a continuous single source of truth. Start today with a free personalized demo of MineOS, the industry's top no-code privacy and data ops solution. For more information about MineOS, visit their website at www.mineos.ai. Enjoy the show. Personal views and opinions expressed by our podcast guests are their own and are not legal advice or official statements by their organizations. Hello, my name is Debbie Reynolds. This is the Data Diva Talks Privacy podcast, where we discuss data privacy issues with industry leaders around the world with information that businesses need to know now. I have a very special guest on the show today, Dan Caprio, who is the chairman of the Providence Group and also the vice chair of the Internet of Things Advisory Board by the U.S. Department of Commerce. Welcome.
Thanks, Debbie. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm very excited to have you on the show. I've gotten to know you over the time that I've been on this Internet of Things advisory board, and you just have such a wealth of knowledge and experience. And I would love for you to be able to talk about your career trajectory in privacy. You know, where all the bodies are buried, you know, all the stuff about what's happening in the US on privacy. So, yeah, introduce yourself.
Thanks, Debbie. My background in Washington, D.C., I started on Capitol Hill and worked in the House and the Senate, and then was at the Commerce Department. Spent a few years working for the state of Illinois in state government. And then at the mid-career mark, I was working for KPMG in government affairs and was really enjoying all of that. But like a lot of people in privacy, my fork in the road came, and this was more than 25 years ago, when my friend Orson Swindle, who had worked at the Commerce Department, was appointed to the Federal Trade Commission. And so Orson asked me to join him, and that was obviously an easy decision. In terms of our careers, we all face that fork in the road. And for me, it was leaving lobbying and government affairs per se behind and took more of a regulatory turn, because I realized I really enjoy living in DC, enjoy public policy, enjoy connecting people, but that for the long term, this was in 1997, that privacy and technology policy was going to be really important, and that the best place to be able to learn the craft, if you will, was at the Federal Trade Commission. And I was blessed to be with Orson for 7 years at the FTC. When his term was expiring, I went to the Commerce Department with Secretary Evans, where I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Technology Policy and the Chief Privacy Officer, which was the best job ever, because I got to think about, and this is in 2005, I got to think about how to promote innovation and protect privacy. So I stayed with the Department of Commerce for a couple of years, left, went out on my own and started a consulting practice. Spent a few years in law firm life at McKenna, Long and Aldrich. Really enjoyed that. Not a lawyer, but really enjoyed my time at McKenna. But then the time came, the second fork in the road. I was enjoying what I was doing in law firm life, but wanted to do it a little differently. So we founded the Providence Group back in 2015 to really focus on privacy and cyber, or what we now refer to as data risk. So we do that for boards and CEOs and advise on how to assess and govern data risk and future risk. In terms of, just to touch on the Internet of Things Advisory Board, the Internet of Things has been a labor of love for me for over 20 years. Really started when I was at the Department of Commerce. And my transatlantic focus was the European Commission, and at the time was the Internet of Things. And so fast forward to where we are today, I was honored to be asked to be vice chair of the Internet of Things Advisory Board. And it's been a pleasure to work on that. And it's been my pleasure to get to know you and to see the contribution that you've made to the Internet of Things Advisory Board in a way that's been very, not always easy, but you've brought a lot of ideas, a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of energy, but you've also been a very good and trusted colleague because you sought consensus. And that's the way that we make policy. Nobody gets all of what they want, but I'm proud to call you a friend, and I've really enjoyed getting to know you and look forward to working with you in the future.
Oh, you're going to make me cry on my podcast. Thank you so much.
That was not my intent.
Well, you've been a tremendous support, and I love your background. I love your story and all the things that you're doing. You bring it all to bear on this work that we're doing together. The internet, I'll just say for the audience who doesn't understand, the Internet of Things Advisory Board was an advisory board that was, I guess, summoned by the U.S. Department of Commerce. So it consists of 16 people in the U.S. who were selected to be on this board. We're all from different parts, different agencies, different walks of life. And we are there to create a report that will be public. The report, once it comes out, will go to also the federal working group that focuses on the Internet of Things. And also they will create a report, and our report and their report will go to Congress. So we're excited that in 2024 that report will come out. I'll be sure to share it with everyone. I think even though the report isn't focused on privacy, we have a lot of stuff in privacy in this report because, as you know, and I think as you were saying about your company, even when you're talking about data, you have to bring in privacy into that equation. So being able to have those discussions is very important, and being able to advance the ball, I think, is very important. One thing I want your thoughts about, or I want you to be able to talk about, and this is something that I learned from being on the board and talking with you and understanding the lay of the land. I think people from the outside, when they see US and they think about privacy and they try to compare it with Europe and things like that. We're a different country. We have a different history. Things are hard to do, especially in privacy. And so I think sometimes people from an outside view, they think, hey, why don't we just do the GDPR in the US? And what I found is that there are a lot of crevices that have to be filled in. There are a lot of things that have to be addressed before we can do some huge, big privacy thing on a federal level. What are your thoughts?
Well, that's a great question. Reflecting just for a minute on Europe and my career. Fortunately, I've been in privacy long enough that I had the good fortune of meeting and actually working with some of the original pioneers like Alan Weston. And what's forgotten, really, that's worth noting about Europe and GDPR is that the United States and Europe in the late 60s, early 70s both started in the same place with privacy and continue to agree. We could have a whole episode on this, but in 1974, we had the passage of the Privacy Act, which is still in force and has a lot of meaning to those in federal government. It really does afford a lot of privacy protections to the public. But that act, as it was about to be passed, at the time, it was public and private. So it was going to be all of privacy, commercial. Well, commercial managed to exempt itself out. And so we do have the Privacy Act of 1974, We continued on the road with the Europeans toward the OECD privacy guidelines in 1980, which still serve us well. But it was at that point in the implementation of the OECD privacy guidelines, and this is pre-European Commission, but 15 years later, that turned into 1995 Data Directive. That was really the point of departure. But we started in the same place. We share a lot of common values. The European Commission has evolved a lot since the 95 Data Directive in the direction of GDPR, and now, of course, in the direction of the EU AI Act and Digital Services Act and Digital Marketing Act and lots of other regulation. But in the US, we've taken, for better or worse, a sectoral approach to privacy. And we've said, sensitive areas of information need to be protected. So that's medical, financial, children. I look back on my career at the FTC. In hindsight's always 2020. You do the best you can with the information that you have. And when I started at the FTC, this is pre-97, pre-Google, pre-Facebook. If we could have known then what we know now, there were lots of really strong bipartisan efforts to pass a comprehensive privacy bill in the early 2000s. But the decision was made that it was too early, that we need to give industry a chance to self-regulate. And that hasn't worked. And the FTC has the FTC Act, and that's unfair deceptive acts and practices in commerce. And so the FTC has to enforce against that in terms of privacy, against that broad statute. So if we could have a mulligan, a do-over, to turn the clock back 20 years, knowing what we know now, there would have been a privacy bill. A lot of the discussion, a lot of what we spent the last 20 years working on with the Europeans in terms of cross-border data transfers and safe harbor, privacy shields, challenges to TRIMS 1, TRIMS 2. We have spent so much time just bending over backwards to be adequate, which is a European term. And we'll see. There's going to be a TRIMS 3. We'll see if all the work and I think the U.S. government really is, and the European Commission too, but the U.S. government really is to be commended for the whole of government approach to the fix for TRIMS 2. And the fact that TRIMS is not really about privacy, it's more about national security. We've fixed all that. The involvement of the intel community post-Snowden and the cleanup to that mess has really led us to where we are now. So I think what we have is a very comprehensive tool. We'll see if it works, and I hope it withstands the European Court of Justice. But it's quite remarkable for those who are not in government to appreciate the amount of time and energy that's gone into privacy and all of these adequacy decisions really for the last 20 years, but especially the last 5 years, since we brought national security into it and sort of the fix post Shrims and post Snowden.
Yeah, that's remarkable work. It's really hard. So I've been on the sidelines looking at that developing over the years. So I've been working with the data directive. I've been working with data even before that came out. So I think we kind of align on that, but I was more in private sector. So for people who don't understand, I feel like people just talk about this a lot. Why doesn't the US have a federal privacy law? I want you to tell me, why is it so difficult? So people don't understand the difficulty of doing this in the US right now.
It's difficult. There's a couple of reasons. One is jurisdictional. Think of regulated industry and unregulated industry. Regulated industry being telcos and ISPs. And so this goes back to all the regulation during the Depression. Securities and Exchange Commission, Federal Communication Commission. There were a lot of acts in like 1934, 1935. So regulated industry, being the telcos and ISPs, has understood the need for regulation for a long, long, long time. What we found with the growth of the internet, or when I started at the FTC, was most of the players in the internet were unregulated. And so they hadn't lived then, they hadn't lived in a regulated world. They didn't understand the regulated world. And so a lot of the tech companies were asking at the time for self regulation. And we did have an approach. We said, like I said earlier, medical, financial, children. And we had the FTC trying to enforce the FTC Act. And it was really simple at the time. It was a simpler time. But we would say, if you make a promise, you have to keep it. A lot of arguments about deception. When Tim Uris arrived at the FTC, the conversation began to change a little bit more in terms of how would you enforce unfairness. Tim's view of privacy was that we needed to devote a lot more resources to it, and the FTC needed to bring a lot more enforcement actions, which it did, including the first unfairness case, which Tim and Howard Beals laid the groundwork for, but was actually brought, I believe, when Debbie Majoris was chair. We had a system that kind of worked at the time. Obviously, the velocity of change, we haven't been able to keep up. In Washington, there's a lot of different interest around privacy. I mean, a lot of different industries. So, a lot of privacy, the main committee of jurisdiction has been the Commerce Committee in the House and the Senate. But that doesn't include healthcare, financial services. And so I think that's been a challenge. But you've also had the challenge between regulated industry and unregulated industry, which is still mostly the tech companies. And the other thing I've learned about being in Washington for so long is passing major legislation, comprehensive legislation like this is hard. I mean, it usually takes 2 or 3 Congresses. And the fact that it hasn't moved this Congress is a little surprising because there's been major movement in the last Congress. And now Kathy McMorris Rogers is retiring. So it's a jump ball to see what happens in the next Congress. But I think the other thing that's interesting about it, and this is less answering your question, but sort of looking forward, is that the focus that Congress has paid to AI, rightly so. But AI is not new. You've been involved in machine learning. And what's new about it is the large language models and the speed at which all of that is developing. But if you look at AI, it just exacerbates the problems that we have in privacy. And it really argues, I think, for a fresh approach to privacy regulation. And we can talk about that a little bit more. But the easiest way to say it is I remember working on what became the 96 Telecom Act. That was 3 or 4 Congresses. It was 8 years worth of work to get to the 96 Act. You're talking about something that's at least that complicated. And with different constituencies and lobbying interest, the stars just haven't really aligned. It's easier to stop things from happening than it is sometimes for things to actually happen. And I think we need a fresh look at privacy and the Internet of Things and AI in terms of how we regulate it. The Internet of Things and artificial intelligence, I think, give us that opportunity to look at legislation more through the prism of data risk. There's been a lot of effort over the last 20 years to look at collection, individual use, and harm. And those things are all important. But I think what we're seeing now is this all rolls up to something much, much bigger, which is data risk. You never start with a clean piece of paper. That's what I've learned about the legislative process. But I think it's going to require new leadership and fresh thinking from members and academia and civil society and industry. And the fact that you mentioned at the beginning about the European Commission, the United States is the last country in the world to not have a privacy law. And it's really an impediment in international fora. I think AI is forcing that discussion, but we can talk about this in the IoT Advisory Board. The report's going to advocate very strongly for a comprehensive federal privacy law. But I think we're long overdue, but we're going to have to go back and rethink some old assumptions. And I think AI gives us a perfect opportunity to do that.
Right. I agree. I love that when we talk, it's like a shorthand because we know all the impediments, all the arguments, all the constraints that we have there. Since you brought up the Internet of Things Advisory Board, I'll just say the typical disclaimer that our words are not those of the board, and if people are interested in that, they can go to the Department of Commerce and this website to see the meeting notes. All of our meetings are public, all of our discussions and consensus things are public. But I would love to chat about the parts of the report that are privacy related that you think are very key and you think that will get people's interests in the work that we've done.
Well, I think you're right. We speak only for ourselves, not on behalf of the board. Our deliberations are public. And we have been working hard at this for over a year. I think we have a meeting next week, which I think is our 11th 2-day meeting in just a little over 12 months. An insane amount of work. But we have posted some draft comments. You can see the contours of where this is headed. We've got some things to still iron out. I don't think those areas are necessarily in privacy and data risk. It's fair to say that given the congressional interest in Internet of Things, Federal Advisory Committee was stood up. What we need, and I think what's come out of the advisory board, is something of a reset on the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things has been the shiny new object for the last 20 years. Like a lot of shiny new objects, a lot of hype, the Gardner hype curve, the trough of despair, and interoperability issues, and lots of things. But now we've gotten to the point where we're actually into implementation, and the data from the Internet of Things really is the data that feeds artificial intelligence. So the reset is we need in the US a national strategy on the Internet of Things. So what does that mean? That means that there needs to be more focus on it in Congress, in the executive branch, at the Office of Science and Technology Policy. In the same way we've focused on nanotechnology, on quantum, on the CHIPS Act, there needs to be that similar level of focus on the Internet of Things, because there's all these inexpensive devices that are collecting a lot of data that impact people's privacy and, important for the network, a lot of cybersecurity implications. So articulating that we need a national strategy, that the Internet of Things really is part of the US, the Office of Science and Technology Policy publishes a critical emerging technology list. I think in spite of all the hype in the last 20 years, Internet of Things is still an emerging technology and has lots of implications that need to be addressed. So that's number one. The second part, which we've talked about, is we need a comprehensive privacy law, comprehensive federal privacy law that includes privacy and cyber for IoT devices. The third thing, which is actually probably the most significant development in the Internet of Things, this has been in the works for probably 20 years, but it's the creation of this cyber trust mark that's been led by the White House and all the executive branch agencies, that is now at the FCC as the program owner to implement rules around the cyber trust mark, which is a voluntary public-private partnership to give consumers, when they buy something off the shelf, that this cyber trust mark says, here's the security, here's what goes into this product. And the FCC has it. They've issued a notice of proposed rulemaking. I think the program will be, the hope is, up and running by the end of the year. And that creates, I think, enormous opportunities for international collaboration with the European Commission. There's been a lot of work done on a similar trust mark in Australia, Singapore. The Internet Governance Forum has paid a lot of attention to it. And so the idea of working toward conformity assessment so that the label in Europe and the label in the US, they don't have to be harmonized, but that they work toward the same end. So I'm very optimistic about the cyber trust mark, and I think the Internet of Things Advisory Board will give a very strong thumbs up to continue the public-private partnership and press on in terms of international cooperation and conformity assessment. And that's the biggest deal to me in the Internet of Things in the last 20 years. So I'm very optimistic about that.
Yeah. One thing I want to talk about that is going to be part of the report that comes out is universal opt-out. So I'm excited about this part of the report because there's just so much data that's collected. I think as you were describing the Internet of Things, where there was this hype cycle and people thought it was a big hot new thing. And obviously, every time in the press, every couple of months, there's like a new shiny object that catches people's attention. But while that's been happening, what's happened is that Internet of Things devices are so ubiquitous now. Most people, they don't understand that they have so many more internet connected devices in their homes, in their offices. Actually, there's a statistic that said that companies have more Internet of Things devices than they do computers in their organizations. So these are all devices that, if not secured properly, could create a cyber risk. There is a privacy risk there. And I think that consumers, whether it's companies buying devices or individuals buying devices, don't really know what's happening in these devices. So for me, I call an Internet of Things device almost like a computer without a screen. So it's doing something that you may not know about. So being able to have people have more agency over their choices and not have to do it in a way that makes it difficult for them to make those choices, I think is very key. What are your thoughts?
I agree with you wholeheartedly. I really appreciate your leadership within the advisory board on this issue. You've been very tenacious and constructive and willing to work in a process is difficult at times. But I think you see the idea, the concept of the opt out in federal law, we haven't even talked about state law, but it's a well recognized concept. And our report, when it comes out, coming out in favor of that, I think is significant because unfortunately, we're not going to have a privacy law this Congress. And there's lots of other reasons, and dysfunction in Congress is high among them. And it's an election year. But I think with our report and the idea of an IoT opt out, I think that's a very strong recommendation and something that policymakers should really give a lot of thought and attention to. And it's really because of your leadership on the advisory board that we've gotten there.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, I'm from Chicago, so I'm quite tenacious.
You and I figured this out. I lived in Chicago and I'm a Cubs fan, even though we did win the World Series in 2016. Thank goodness. But I'm an eternal optimist. You can't survive in DC for 40 years without being optimistic. As we say in the North Side, I know you're a Sox fan, but there's always next year. So there's always next year. I mean, we haven't said that yet because the season hasn't started for the Cubs, but there's always next year when it comes to privacy. And I think what's important about our report and a lot of other things, and there's been a lot of really terrific academic work over the years. But the latest thinking by Dan Solov on AI and data risk, it's a turning point. And so we need to be optimistic and to continue to contribute and hopefully move Congress in the right direction in terms of comprehensive federal privacy law.
Right. What is, in your view, the opportunity for privacy because of AI? Obviously, there are risks that are heightening as a result of these different types of data uses, and it's hard to get a hold of that, understand that. But even in the most recent executive order from the Biden White House on AI, I think privacy was mentioned 30 plus times in there. I think people who've been working in spaces that you work in understand how the underpinnings of privacy can help and need to be addressed when we move forward into this new AI age. But what are your thoughts?
You mentioned the Biden executive order. That's another turning point. And I alluded to the US government and its response to Snowden and its response to the Schrems European Court of Justice cases invalidating safe harbor. and the creation of Privacy Shield as a whole of government approach. And so the Biden executive order is the same thing. And the amount of cooperation within the government and all the different timelines and reports that are all in the midst of being written now, and the level of international cooperation in my almost 40 years of tech policy, I've never seen anything like it in terms of bilateral cooperation, all of the meetings that go on that are regularly scheduled around cybersecurity, for instance, with the European Commission, multilateral being the OECD, the G7, and the fact that all those multilateral fora have taken up AI with the understanding that a legislative solution is going to be more complicated and take more time. That's all very encouraging. So where we go from here in terms of privacy professionals, there's a huge opportunity. There's also a huge risk. The risk is, and you see this more in Europe with the EU AI Act. We worked on GDPR for a solid decade before it passed, and now we're a couple of years into the implementation. And GDPR talks a lot about a risk-based approach, but one of the things that GDPR never really did was to define what is risk. And so what we have is a lot of what's described as risk-based, which really is more compliance. So in other words, the implementation of GDPR goes so far down into the bowels of the company that it becomes compliance-based. The strategic element of how do you use data and what's the data risk at the senior executive level, at the board level. There are some companies that have addressed that, but most have invested just a lot of resources and a lot of time into compliance. And so privacy's gotten the attention that it deserves, but in some ways it's the wrong attention. I think AI, on the other hand, because there are so many opportunities to use AI to enhance efficiency, staffing, the list goes on and on and on, that companies are beginning to understand that there's got to be a level of compliance in terms of the algorithm, bias, transparency. And for the sake of argument, let's stipulate most companies want to do the right thing with AI. Nobody intends for their AI or machine learning or facial recognition. The FTC case against Rite Aid. Now the FTC has reached a settlement with Rite Aid because their facial recognition software was impactful in the wrong way to certain communities. And so they've said, if you're Rite Aid, you can't use this for 5 years. It's a wake-up call. But I think most companies have seen the wake-up call and are now beginning to understand they've got to put systems in place around AI. We're okay up to a point where there's human intervention. But the point where AI is beginning to interact without human intervention is coming a lot more quickly than people think. And that's where, as a company CEO or senior leader or board of directors, you've got to start to think about how do you put policies and procedures in place to ensure that you have human intervention, that your AI systems are not just running on their own. It's present day. We're talking about something that is upon us now. So the issue, I think, for privacy professionals and for all professionals is how do we get to governance of AI that builds upon compliance around bias and transparency, all the things that we have talked about, but then is able to articulate at the CEO level or the board level and through the organization that here are the policies and procedures that are formalized. Because in the corporate world, I've seen this time and time again over the years, is there's a lot of times when a new technology comes up, we deal with it with intentionality, but it's almost more ad hoc. Form a committee and look at the shiny new object and report back. And so that informal mechanism that's served us so well, that has turned into formal governance for lots of other systems and networks, has really got to take place very rapidly around AI. And I think that's the opportunity for privacy professionals, because AI is so interdisciplinary, involves so many different parts of the organization between legal and human resources and the engineering. And privacy professionals We talk a little bit about a whole of government approach. What I think we need on the corporate side is we need a whole of company approach. And the AI is not something that can just be handled by one stovepipe. You've really got to look at it across the enterprise and figure out what the right governance structure is. And I think that we're seeing the beginnings of that now, but that's the exciting opportunity.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. So, if it were the world according to you, Dan, and we did everything you said, what would be your wish for privacy anywhere in the world, whether that be regulation, technology, or human behavior?
That's a big question. Well, I would start with a Conference of Federal Privacy Law. We've needed that since the early 2000s. And without that, we're just handicapped. And I think AI is forcing that. But I think the most important part of this is really the governance challenge. So we're going to have to roll up our sleeves and figure this out and advise our clients on how systems and networks are in place to, and I'm speaking more in a cyber sense, but it's not really a cyber issue per se, but that we have the level of compliance that we need. And but you build upon that to a governance structure. And we work with outside experts. We've been leaning into NASDAQ, a lot of their work on board governance and AI. My wish is, unlike what happened in cyber and still happening in cyber, is there is no checklist. If there was a checklist, we would have solved cyber a long, long, long time ago. I think my hope is that people will understand this is a dynamic process that involves governance. There are no shortcuts. It's hard, but that if someone tells you there's a checklist to follow, we've been down that road with cyber, and in some ways we're still stuck in cyber because of that thinking. So I think with AI, my hope is that we will think more broadly and dynamically and in a more strategic way, measure the opportunity, but also the data risk in a way that is meaningful and translates into a policy that can permeate down from this senior level of a company all the way down into compliance, because that's what we're going to need for AI.
I agree. I agree with that. So we have to dispense with the tactics and move forward with some type of strategy that we can bundle into policy and have it, I hate to say the word trickle down, but it has to permeate through all parts of the organization.
100%.
Well, thank you so much, Dan. I'm so happy that we were able to do this session. I'm so proud of the work that we've been able to do together and the board has been able to do on the IoT Internet of Things Advisory Board. And you're just so much fun to talk to because I love the shorthand and we understand what's happening. And this is an exciting time. And it is a turning point, I think, in terms of how people are thinking about privacy, especially as it relates to AI. So yeah, we'll talk more for sure.
Thank you for the opportunity and look forward to working with you in the future.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'll talk to you soon, next week.
Thank you.
All right. All right.